Hey, in this video, we're going to be talking about inflation. Inflation in fiat currency, in proof of work currency, and in proof of stake currency. We're going to learn the difference between the three and how it affects the economics of cryptocurrency. Let's talk about fiat currency. I want you to imagine an old-timey money counterfeiter. He has built his printing press in his basement, he got the right paper, he's got the right ink, and he's making all of these fake banknotes. Now this guy is printing money, but he's not actually offering any service, he's not actually engaging in any form of commerce or anything like that. So the money has to come from somewhere, right? If he's getting richer, where does the money come from? So imagine that this guy is an aficionado of dark chocolate. He takes his freshly printed banknotes, barely dry, he goes to the chocolate store and he just buys a bunch of chocolate. So, he's getting what he wants in life, he's getting more chocolate. But the chocolatier is also getting richer. He's never seen such good business in his life. He's selling a lot more chocolate now that this new guy's in town, buying all of these dark chocolates. So he's also getting richer. And the guy who sells him the cocoa bean, well, he's also expanding his operations now because there's just so much demand now for cocoa beans. So he's hiring more people. So now we see that it seems people are only getting richer. All the people downstream of that guy, they're all getting richer. So again, where does the money come from? And the money comes from the fact that everyone else who enjoys chocolate, they now have to have higher prices. The chocolate factories, they had to raise their prices. The cocoa producer has to raise their prices. So for everyone else, life has become a little more expensive. So now we see where the money comes from. By printing money, he's diluting everyone who owes money. Their money purchase less goods because he's bidding up the price of good by purchasing it with the fake money. So some people are getting richer. They're called the quintillion insiders. They're close to the money printing. There's the chocolatiers, there's the cocoa bean producers, and some people are far from the money press. They're not downstream of all this economic activity, and they just get higher prices. So there's going to be winners and going to be losers, and it's going to depend on how far you are from the printing press. So there's a cost associated to that, which is that the economy has to adapt to the changing prices, and that's a real cost, that's a real burden. But mostly it's a transfer. It's a transfer between people who are far from the printing press to people who are close to the printing press. Now, of course, counterfeiting is illegal by definition. And when central governments print money, that's not exactly how they do it, but you still have this quintillion effect of insiders and outsiders. So the financial industry and the governments are the closest, and then everything that's downstream is going to be financial assets. All of that is going to be beat up by inflation first, and then it makes its way in the economy. Now let's talk about proof of work inflation. When we think of proof of work, we sometimes think of Bitcoin. When we think of Bitcoin, we think of a 21 million cap. So is there even inflation in Bitcoin? Well, yes, in every block, there is a block subsidy or a reward for the miner, which is currently about 6.125 Bitcoin every 10 minutes. And that amounts to about 1.8% inflation per year at the current supply, which is a moderate number, but it is still inflation. So who gets this reward? Well, the miners, the people who produce the block. How do they get it? Well, they have to solve the proof of work problem. They have to spend a lot of electricity. So how much exactly are the miners spending in Bitcoin to produce all these blocks? Well, because it's a very competitive system, because anyone can start mining and competing with other miners, if it were much cheaper to produce a Bitcoin by mining it than it would be by buying it, then you would have more miners and there would be more hash power and the difficulty would go up. And conversely, if somehow it were much more expensive to produce a Bitcoin by mining it than by buying it, then people would stop mining and they would buy Bitcoin instead. So you have an equilibrium, and you can imagine that the total amount of cost between electricity, operational expenses, capital cost for mining in Bitcoin is about currently 1.8% of the market cap of Bitcoin per year. It's not exactly that because there's a lag, because sometimes there will be a huge buildup in mining capacity, sometimes it will slow down, but ballpark, you are around that number. But that number is an expense. All of that capital is spent. It's spent in electricity, it's spent on real world resources. Unlike fiat currencies, inflation here is not really a transfer, it's a lot more like a cost. Real economic resources are being diverted, real economic resources are being spent. There are economic resources diverted in our first case because more is allocated towards chocolate, but at least someone gets to have the chocolate. Here, no one gets to have the chocolate is burned. Now, there's many benefits to mining. You can secure the network, you can argue that it's a fair system, but you cannot argue that it is a cost. Now, how costly is it exactly to have 3% inflation? Well, a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin is almost infinitely divisible. So it doesn't really matter how many Bitcoin there are in circulation, so long as it's a finite number at any given time of Bitcoin in circulation. So if you have 3% more Bitcoin, Bitcoin is not more useful than it was before, which means that the market cap of Bitcoin shouldn't change. If you have 3% more Bitcoin appear all of a sudden, it doesn't make Bitcoin more useful to have 3% more Bitcoin or 2% more Bitcoin. So all else equal, if you have 2% more Bitcoin, the purchasing power of a single Bitcoin should be about 2% less. Now, there are many factors which affect the price of Bitcoin, and the fact that there's 2% more is just a blip compared to the different factors that affect it. It is really not the main driver, even though, and that's per article, it's the people who are most passionate about Bitcoin, which will actually make a huge deal out of it, even though it doesn't actually have a large impact. But what about the cap? Bitcoin is supposed to have a 21 million cap, so at the end of the day, there's no more inflation. The difficulty here is that the security of Bitcoin rests on the fact that you pay the miners, and miners have a financial incentive to mine and to put hash power behind the chain. Now, the idea in Bitcoin is that once you reach the 20 million coin cap, there's no block reward anymore. It's just transaction fees, people paying transaction fees. And hopefully, it's so valuable at this point to make a transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain that this is enough of a subsidy for miners. But it's not necessarily clear that that's the case. People are very good at lowering the cost of things. The cost of things generally goes down over time. And if people can find cheaper ways of making their transactions without paying large fees on the chain, they will. Maybe they will be using off-chain solutions like the Lightning Network. Maybe they will be using lines of credits between each other. Maybe they will use hardware modules so that they can trade private keys without actually making a transaction. There are many ways to imagine how you can make transactions without the transaction actually hitting the chain. And they will do so if it's costly to post transactions on the chain. Now, it could be that despite this, there will always be a residual demand for on-chain transaction, which will be so high that it will be sufficient to subsidize the security of the network. But this is actually unknown. Now, let's talk about proof of stake and inflation in proof of stake. In proof of stake, you also have a block reward, but the security also comes from bonds, which are placed by stakers and which can be forfeited if the stakers deviate from the honest strategy, which is sometimes called slashing. The big difference is, where does the block reward go? In mining, the block reward goes to the miner, but the miner is going to spend most of it paying for infrastructure and paying for electricity. So all of it is going to be consumed. It's a cost for the network. In proof of stake, part of the block reward is going to be spent by the staker to maintain their operation so that they can run computers, but that's a fairly limited cost. And the rest generally is going to flow back to the token holders. In Tezos, for example, inflation is about 5% per year, and the bakers who put up the bond and who actually run baking nodes to secure the chain, they collect that. And typically, they're going to take about 80 to 90% of that amount, and they pay it to delegators. They pay it to people who hold the cryptocurrency. So most of the reward, the vast majority of the reward, in fact, flows back to the token holder. When people look at this, they make two mistakes, and those two mistakes are equal and opposite. One mistake is people who think, isn't this great? There's a block, there's all this staking rewards, we're getting passive income, this is fantastic. And they're wrong. It's not really income because there's nothing productive behind it. It's just inflation. They're not getting more money, they're getting more units of a currency, but the currency has inflated. So if you get 3% more units of a currency which has inflated by 3%, you're staying in place. That's all you're doing. And on the other hand, you have people who say, proof of stake is horrible. Look at this. There's this 5% inflation. That's a lot of inflation. And we know inflation is bad. But that's when inflation is dilutive. That's when inflation either consumes real resources or shifts resource from some people to other people. But that's not the case here. It's non-dilutive because those 3% end up back in everyone's pockets. So if we take the example of the quintillion insiders and the quintillion outsiders, what mattered here was proximity to the printing press. There was this unevenness. But if you inflate everything and you inflate everything evenly, there's just no effect. The only difference is that the balance changes, but it doesn't change anything about the underlying currency. That's a great approximation, and that is standard mainstream economic theory. However, there are deviations from that approximation which are interesting. One is tax treatment. So depending on jurisdiction and depending on tax treatment, there can be an effect. So the tax code may look at it differently if you're inflated by 5% and receive 5%, as if you were inflated by 0% and receive 0%, and that can have some effects. And there's actually interesting legal work in the US on that end around proof of stake. There's also a psychological effect, which is known in economics as the money illusion. And the money illusion means that people tend to fall in the category of looking at this as income as opposed to just staying in place. They will discount inflation and say, oh, I am getting more units of my currency. Now, even though this is a psychological effect, the economic consequences are real, because this is not a money is not a productive asset. It is not an asset which depends on some sort of underlying economic or productive activities. It has a dynamic of a store of value and a medium of exchange. And so psychological effects end up being real economic effects. But overall, the baseline is that don't look at inflation and proof of stake in isolation, and don't look at rewards in isolation. You have to look at the balance between the two and how they cancel out, or if they cancel out. So that's the difference between inflation in fiat currencies, proof of work cryptocurrencies, and proof of stake cryptocurrencies. In fiat currencies, it's not really a cost. Some might argue it's even a benefit, but it does increase inequality because some people will get richer at the expense of others. In proof of work cryptocurrencies, it's egalitarian, but it's a cost that's borne by everyone. It is a cost. There are real resources being spent, and it is a cost which is in excess of the mere securing of the network. The cost is what makes the security. The fact that it's very, very costly. In proof of stake, you pay for the cost of servers, you pay for the cost of the traditional cost of validating transactions, but no more, and you have an even amount of inflation. And that's a very, very different way of looking at inflation in these three different types of monetary instruments. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope that was clear. I really recommend going to a blog post that I wrote about the topic at my blog, ex.rs. You can find it here. I go into way more than this. I go into the governance aspects and how you can credibly enforce supply caps, what they mean, and what inflation mean in proof of stake cryptocurrencies. If you're interested in this topic, I highly encourage you to read it. Now remember to click like and subscribe. And also I'm going to be making more videos. And so if you want me to talk about any topic, please tell me in the comments what you'd like me to talk about in my next video. Thank you.